The 9,560th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is protection of civilians in armed conflict. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Israel, Pakistan, and Tunisia to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. I propose that the Council invite the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in the meeting, in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in the meeting. Mr. Ramesh Rajasingham, Director of Coordination, United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Mr. Maurizio Martina, Deputy Director General, Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And Mr. Carl Skau, Deputy Executive Director, United Nations World Food Programme. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Ramesh Rajasingham.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, Excellencies, in Resolution 2417 of 2018, you requested the Secretary General report to you swiftly when the risk of conflict-induced famine and widespread food insecurity occurred in armed conflict. And I'm here to report on a grave situation in Gaza. Our discussion today will come as no surprise. Since the start of the current hostilities following the horrific Hamas attacks in Israel on October 7, the UN has warned about the potentially deleterious impact on food insecurity in Gaza, particularly for a population already experiencing high levels of structural poverty after 16 years of blockade. In December, it was projected that the entire population of 2.2 million people in Gaza would face high levels of acute food insecurity by February 2024. The highest share of people facing this level of food insecurity ever recorded worldwide. And here we are at the end of February, with at least 576,000 people in Gaza, 1/4 of the population, one step away from famine, with 1 in 6 children under 2 years of age in northern Gaza suffering from acute malnutrition and wasting. And practically the entire population of Gaza are left to rely on woefully inadequate humanitarian food assistance to survive. Unfortunately, as grim as the picture we see today, there is every possibility for further deterioration. Military operations, insecurity, and extensive restrictions on the entry and delivery of essential goods have decimated food production and agriculture. Food security experts warn of complete agricultural collapse in northern Gaza by May if conditions persist, with fields and productive assets damaged, destroyed, or inaccessible. Many have had little choice but to abandon productive farmland due to evacuation orders and repeated displacement. The hostilities and shortages of essential supplies, including electricity, fuel, and water, have left food production at a virtual standstill. The 5 mills operating in Gaza prior to October 7 ceased operations as far back as November. Heavy damage to water infrastructure from fighting and the severing of power and fuel supplies in October have significantly affected access to water that is essential for food production and the prevention of malnutrition and illness. Fishing, long an important source of nutrition and income in Gaza, has been a practical impossibility since October 7, when sea access for boats was entirely prohibited. A lack of fodder and water, as well as the fighting, has also claimed the lives of livestock, removing yet another important source of food and income. And the commercial sector, a key part of the food distribution network prior to October 7, has been crippled by the lack of local produce and extensive restrictions on commercial imports. Commodities such as wheat flour and eggs and dairy have been almost entirely depleted in parts of Gaza. Meanwhile, the scarcity of available products has sent prices soaring to prohibitive levels at a time when livelihoods have been wiped out by the conflict. Hunger and the risk of famine are exacerbated by factors that go beyond just the availability of food. Inadequate water, sanitation, and health services creates a cycle of vulnerability where malnourished people, especially among the tens of thousands of people who are injured, become more susceptible to disease that further depletes the body's nutritional reserves. A steep rise in malnutrition among children and pregnant and breastfeeding women in the Gaza Strip is a particularly grave concern. And add chronic overcrowding, exposure to the cold, and an absence of adequate shelter to this lack of nutrition, and you have created the conditions for massive disease epidemics. My colleagues from the World Food Programme and the Food and Agriculture Organization will address these issues in more detail. Madam President, with people in Gaza unable to rely on markets and other usual sources of food, humanitarian food assistance is now nearly the sole source of subsistence. Yet, as we have reported to the Council on numerous occasions, the humanitarian community is facing overwhelming obstacles just to get a bare minimum of supplies into Gaza, let alone mounting the multi-sectoral response that would be required to avert a famine. Our efforts continue to be beset by crossing closures, serious movement restrictions, access denials, onerous vetting procedures, incidents involving desperate civilians, protests and a breakdown in law and order, restrictions on communications and protective equipment, and impassable supply routes due to damaged roads and unexploded ordnance. Security risks remain a significant obstacle. The shelling on 20 February of the Médecins Sans Frontières guest house in El Mawasi highlights the weak implementation of precautions that all parties are required to take, and of the humanitarian notification system that aims to maximize these. This has left operations extremely dangerous for humanitarian workers. And we cannot forget the 161 humanitarian workers killed in the hostilities so far. And the suspension of funding to UNRWA challenges our capacity to mount any effective response. An estimated 1.7 million people, over 3/4 of the population of Gaza, reside in UNRWA-run and other public emergency shelters. Last week, the Commissioner General informed the General Assembly that the agency's ability to fulfill its mandate is now seriously threatened and that its operations in the region will be severely compromised from March. Nevertheless, we continue ceaselessly to plan, search, and call for solutions to overcome the hurdles that would allow us to scale up food delivery and health services. In the immediate term, this includes clearer security guarantees, a better humanitarian notification system to minimize risks, fewer restrictions on telecommunications equipment, the removal of unexploded ordnance, and the use of all possible entry points. The stark reality, however, is that a response at the level required will be impossible without immediate and concerted action by the parties, the Security Council, other member states, and the wider international community. The White Note submitted to this Council sets out recommendations for this action. It includes ensuring respect for international humanitarian law, the resumption of entry of essential food, electricity, fuel, and cooking gas, including by the private sector, the protection and restoration of vital infrastructure and services, including cross-border water pipelines, the lifting of restrictions on fishing activity, access to farmland and the entry of agricultural goods, urgently facilitating greater humanitarian access into and within Gaza, including opening up additional crossing points, and finally, concerted efforts towards ending this conflict altogether. But without a doubt, at this stage, very little will be possible while hostilities continue and while there is a risk that they will spread into the overcrowded areas of south of Gaza. We therefore reiterate our call for a ceasefire. If nothing is done, we fear widespread famine in Gaza is almost inevitable, and the conflict, which since October has claimed the lives of almost 30,000 people and injured more than 70,000, according to the Ministry of Health in Gaza, will have many more victims. We put this before the Council as a matter of urgency. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Rajasingham for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Maurizio Martina.
Madam President, the people of Gaza are experiencing the catastrophic levels of conflict-induced food insecurity and the high risk of conflict-induced famine. That risk is increasing by the day. The main factors driving this risk are intensified hostilities, further reduction of food access, basic services and life-saving assistance, and extreme concentration or isolation of people in inadequate facilities or areas without basic services. An integrated food security phase classification analysis was released that detailed the levels of acute food insecurity in Gaza. The key findings are extremely troubling. 378,000 people were estimated to be experiencing catastrophic IPC phase 5, the most severe phase of acute food insecurity. The entire population of about 2.2 million people in Gaza Strip is estimated to be in crisis or worse, IPC phase 3 and above. The highest percentage of people experiencing such acute food insecurity that the IPC has ever classified. About 50% of the population is projected to be in emergency IPC phase 4, and at least 1 in 4 households be in catastrophic or famine-like condition, IPC phase 5. Excellencies, allow me to elaborate more specifically on the impact of the conflict on agri-food systems. Civilian infrastructures, including but essential for the production, the processing, the distribution of food, has been severely damaged, destroyed, or made inaccessible. Since 9 October, the government of Israel reinforced blockade has included stopping or restricting food, electricity and fuel supply, as well as commercial goods. The entire food supply chain has been affected in different ways. Severe restrictions on fuel shipment are crippling the functioning of water infrastructure and desalination plants, the production and delivery of the key food commodities. Electricity blackouts are severely disrupting agricultural activities and water infrastructure. The only electricity available comes from solar panels and generators. Shortage of safe water persists. The water supply was at only 7% of pre-October levels, with services restricted to water tracking, one functional desalination plant, and one of the 3 main water supply lines, the later of which was only restored in 30 December. Around 97% of the groundwater is reportedly unfit for human consumption. The commercial sector has been decimated due to the near complete lack of imports of essential items, including food. The lack of import means that food stocks have been depleted. Bakeries' capacity to produce bread has been seriously hampered. Before the current conflict, Gaza's food production load service sufficient in most fruit and vegetable, for example. The conflict has severely disrupted this. In the most likely scenario, agricultural production will have collapsed in the north by May 2024. We are already seeing this collapse. Satellite data analysis from December shows a significant decline in the health and the density of crops when compared to the preceding 6 seasons. As of 15 February, 46.2% of all cropland was assessed to be damaged. Within the governorate of Gaza, specifically, 54.8% of cropland were damaged. Likewise, agricultural infrastructure has been devastated, with the highest level of destruction to animal shelters, sheep farms, dairy farms, home farms, and broiler farms. Over 1/4 of wells have been destroyed, with destruction most significant in North Gaza and in Gaza City. 339 hectares of greenhouses have been destroyed, most severely in Gaza City, North Gaza, and Khan Yunis. Moreover, the harvest of olives and citrus fruit, which provides an important source of income, has been heavily impacted by the hostilities, and lack of access to food and damage from airstrike have taken a toll on livestock owners, with many breeders reporting substantial losses. By the end of January, all broiler poultry are assumed to have been slaughtered or died. The mortality rate of cows is assumed to be between 50–65% and approximately 70% of beef cattle and 50% of small ruminants are estimated to be dead. Gaza fishing sector are indirectly providing livelihoods for 100,000 people has come to a standstill. In addition, having restriction of humanitarian assistance, including food and fuel required to distribute it, have rendered impossible any meaningful humanitarian operations. Current levels of assistance are completely disproportionate to the overwhelming needs. Excellencies, the cessation of hostilities and restoration of a humanitarian space to deliver assistance and restore service are essential first steps in eliminating a risk of famine. A critical priority is to restore safe humanitarian access throughout the Gaza Strip and to all those in need of life-saving assistance. Border crossings should be reopened, including the commercial traffic. Essential commodities must be allowed to move into and throughout Gaza. Immediately, multi-sectoral humanitarian assistance must be provided to the entire population, with priority given to the most vulnerable. Basic service must be restored, and this includes restoring cross-border water pipelines, resuming electricity distribution, restoring health facilities, water infrastructure, food production, financial facilities, telecommunication, among others. Excellencies, I thank the Council again for its attention to the food security situation in Gaza. The FAO Director General has joined the Secretary General in calling an immediately humanitarian ceasefire. All parties must respect their obligation under international humanitarian and human rights law and protect civilians. An immediate ceasefire and peace are a prerequisite for the food security, and the right to food is a basic human right. Thank you very much.
I thank Mr. Martina for his briefing, and I now give the floor to Mr. Carl Skau.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you for this opportunity to brief the Council on the current food security crisis in Gaza, together with my colleagues from OCHA and FAO. As you have already heard, the Famine Review Committee has warned of a real prospect of famine by May, with over 500,000 people at risk if that threat is allowed to materialize. Even before October, 2/3 of the people in Gaza were supported with food assistance. Today, food aid is required by almost the entire population of 2.2 million people. Gaza is seeing the worst level of child malnutrition anywhere in the world. 1 child in every 6 under the age of 2 is acutely malnourished. The World Food Programme is ready to swiftly expand and scale up our operations if there is a ceasefire agreement. But in the meantime, the risk of famine is being fueled by the inability to bring critical food supplies into Gaza in sufficient quantities, and the almost impossible operating conditions faced by our staff on the ground. Conditions in northern Gaza are particularly dire. On Sunday, February 18, we resumed deliveries to the north for the first time in 3 weeks. Our intention was to send 10 trucks per day for 7 days to address immediate needs and provide some reassurance to people living there that sufficient food would be brought in. However, on both February 18 and 19, our convoys faced significant obstacles. There were delays at checkpoints, they faced gunfire and other violence, food was looted along the way, and at their destination, they were overwhelmed by desperately hungry people. As a result, we've been forced to pause deliveries of food to the north until conditions are in place that allow for safe distributions, both for our staff and for the people receiving our assistance. This is not a decision WFP has taken lightly, as we know it means conditions will worsen and more people will be at risk of dying from hunger-related causes. But the breakdown in civil order, driven by sheer desperation, is preventing the safe distribution of aid. We are now urgently exploring all viable delivery options to allow the resumption of operations in northern Gaza as soon as possible. This is an absolute humanitarian imperative. The staff on our convoys witnessed catastrophic conditions in the north. Food and clean water are scarce, malnutrition is soaring, and disease is rife. Madam President, immediate action is required to enable a huge increase in the volume of food and other humanitarian supplies going into northern Gaza. This is the only way to calm tension and restore some semblance of civil order. For this to happen, we need a functioning operating environment. We need the port of Ashdod and the Carney crossing to open so we can import food and other essential supplies swiftly and at scale. And we need a working humanitarian notification system and a stable communications network to keep humanitarian staff safe. If nothing changes, a famine is imminent in northern Gaza. We must all double down and live up to our responsibilities to ensure it does not happen on our watch. Meanwhile, in the south of Gaza, WFP and partners are on the ground delivering food as it comes to shelters, to makeshift camps, and to shops. But we're unable to provide regular or sufficient food to people who badly need it. Most food is distributed in Rafah, the hub of WFP's current operations in Gaza, and very little assistance reaches people elsewhere. WFP has made efforts to support the re-establishment of local food systems wherever possible. This has included expanding distribution points to include local shops, supporting bakeries by providing them the wheat flour and other necessary resources to operate, and supplying community-run kitchens that provide hot meals every day. But the fact remains that without safe and greatly expanded access, aid workers cannot mount a relief operations at the scale required to reverse the severe humanitarian crisis now gripping Gaza. It is essential we avert a famine, and this requires much more than just food supplies. Basic services must also be restored, including health services, electricity networks, and water and sanitation pipelines. In this, UNRWA is indispensable. Council members, in 2018, this body adopted Security Council Resolution 2417, which reaffirms international humanitarian law and the need to break the vicious cycle between armed conflict and food insecurity. Today, we call on the Council to uphold its commitments under that resolution. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Mr. Skau for his briefing, and I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Guyana. I wish to thank Deputy Director General Martinez, Deputy Executive Director Skau, and Director Rajasingham for their presentations. Thank you also for your contributions to the White Note that is under consideration. It is deeply concerning to Guyana that everyone in Gaza is food insecure, but even more so, the number of persons who are on the brink of famine. As we know, a famine classification phase 5 represents the highest level of food insecurity on the IPC scale. It means that at least 20% of the entire population face extreme food shortages, and more than 30% face acute malnutrition. Starvation, death, destitution, and extremely acute malnutrition levels are key features. 2 out of every 10,000 persons die from starvation on a daily basis in the famine situation. With 576,000 persons on the brink of famine in Gaza, we could expect at least 115 deaths daily from starvation or disease should their state of food insecurity progress to famine. Excellencies, colleagues, I repeat the meaning of the famine classification and other statistics, both to reiterate the sheer magnitude of the food security crisis in Gaza and to stress that human beings like us are the ones that are subjected to these degrading and undignified circumstances. Men, women, boys and girls, pregnant and nursing women, disabled children, babies, the elderly. This is a catastrophe, not my word, but what famine is defined as on the IPC scale. This catastrophe is on this Council's doorstep, one which requires our urgent action. The circumstances that have led to the current situation are pegged to one factor: the continued blatant disregard for international law and all obligations stemming therefrom. Violations include bombardment of civilian infrastructure, destruction or restriction of objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population, refusal to allow adequate humanitarian access, blockade and siege, and disregard for the principles of humanity, proportionality, and distinction. Some of the consequences of these persistent violations are detailed in the White Note and either existed before or were engendered and accelerated by the events of October 7. Key among these are the high levels of structural poverty in Gaza, the economic challenges resulting from restrictions on movements imposed by the occupier, the near decimation of productive capacity in the agri-food sector, and damage of livelihoods, markets, and supply. In the immediate term, all of this has translated into a high mortality risk due to hunger and malnutrition and disease. As we know, hunger and malnutrition can create physical and cognitive challenges that have serious implications for an entire generation. As such, the capacity of an entire generation in Gaza to acquire the knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development could be hindered. Bombing and shelling and the overall military operations have already affected the health of 18% of all arable lands in Gaza and decimated agriculture production and infrastructure, as our briefers have just indicated. The planned military ground operation in the south, including in Rafah, will further worsen an already desperate situation, given the substantial portion of arable land that is in the south. These realities all emphasize one thing: the Security Council must intervene to stop the blatant violations of international law being committed by a member state of our United Nations. I would not repeat the number of casualties in what is now an ever-increasing arithmetic of misery, but it must be underscored that these violations are being translated into suffering for hundreds of thousands of people in Gaza and silence is not an acceptable response. Guyana fully supports the 7 recommendations contained in the White Note. We emphasize that there must be respect for international law, including international humanitarian law, and an immediate and lasting ceasefire. Guyana is prepared to be part of efforts to realize these goals. Starvation as a method of warfare is illegal, and Guyana condemns those who are deliberately using this as a tool against the population in Gaza. We call on those with influence on the perpetrators to urge their full compliance with international law and to their charter obligations. I thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council, and I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci Madame la Présidente. Je remercie les représentants de OCHA, de la FAO et du PAM pour leurs exposés. La Suisse remercie tous les acteurs humanitaires pour leurs efforts face au niveau alarmant d'insécurité alimentaire et au risque de famine dans la bande de Gaza. La Suisse, en tant que point focal au Conseil pour la thématique sur les conflits et la faim avec le Guyana, est reconnaissante pour la note et ses recommandations. Nous appelons le Conseil de sécurité et les parties au conflit à assumer pleinement les responsabilités qui leur incombent en vertu du droit international, tel que reflété par la résolution 2417. En adoptant cette résolution, ce Conseil a reconnu le lien entre les conflits armés, l'insécurité alimentaire et le risque de famine. Ce faisant, il a également réitéré le devoir qui incombe à toutes les parties au conflit de respecter leurs obligations en vertu du droit international humanitaire et des droits de l'homme, et en particulier celles ayant un impact sur la sécurité alimentaire. La situation humanitaire dans la bande de Gaza est catastrophique. L'escalade des hostilités est la cause principale de l'insécurité alimentaire aiguë. Elle a aggravé une situation de pauvreté structurelle déjà préoccupante suite aux restrictions de mouvement et l'accès imposé dans le cadre du bouclage de la bande de Gaza depuis 16 ans. Nous appelons toutes les parties à respecter le droit international humanitaire et le droit international des droits de l'homme afin de ne pas exacerber une situation
so as not to further aggravate a situation that has already been critical for a long time. The ongoing hostilities have led to massive displacements in a restricted area and a closed-off area, and are having a major impact on water supplies, agriculture, and food production. As a result, the note warns that 1 in 4 people in the Gaza Strip is affected by catastrophic levels of starvation, which are unacceptable. Children, pregnant and lactating women, persons with disabilities, and the elderly face a particularly high risk of mortality due to inadequate nutrition.
Cette insécurité alimentaire aiguë est aggravée par les limitations importantes imposées sur l'acheminement des denrées alimentaires vers l'intérieur de la bande de Gaza. Dans son ordonnance du 26 janvier 2024, la Cour internationale de justice a été claire. Israël va prendre sans délai des mesures effectives pour permettre la fourniture de services de base et de l'aide humanitaire requise de toute urgence afin de remédier aux difficiles conditions d'existence auxquelles est soumise la population palestinienne dans le banc de Gaza. La Suisse rappelle à Israël qu'il doit se conformer à la dite ordonnance de la Cour et prendre les mesures nécessaires pour ce faire. Face à cette situation et aussi en ligne avec les recommandations contenues dans la note, la Suisse souhaite souligner les points suivants. Premièrement, la Suisse appelle toutes les parties à prendre des mesures concrètes pour épargner et protéger la population civile et à respecter le droit international humanitaire, y compris l'interdiction d'utiliser la famine comme méthode de guerre contre la population civile, l'interdiction d'attaquer, de détruire, d'enlever ou de mettre hors d'usage des biens indispensables à la survie
useless objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population, and the obligation to allow and facilitate the rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief supplies to civilians in need. Secondly, all parties must ensure rapid, safe, and unimpeded access to all areas, including the northern Gaza Strip, and through all possible crossings and routes. Commercial food supplies must also be guaranteed so that local markets can be reestablished. Humanitarian aid alone cannot meet the needs of more than 2 million people. Access to fuel and cash must also be facilitated.
Troisièmement, il faut protéger les enfants, les femmes et les groupes vulnérables en répondant à leurs besoins spécifiques.
By responding to their specific needs.
Enfin, la Suisse
And
appelle à une bonne coordination
Switzerland calls for
entre tous
good
les acteurs
coordination
afin de
among all
garantir que les
actors to
travailleurs
ensure that
humanitaires
humanitarian
puissent
workers
s'acquitter
can
de
carry
leur
out their
mission
mission
en toute
in
sécurité
complete
dans
safety
l'ensemble du
throughout the
territoire et en
country,
priorisant l'accès par voie
prioritizing
terrestre.
access by land.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam
notre
President,
action est décisive.
Our action is
Nous,
decisive.
les membres de
We,
ce Conseil,
the members of this
nous devons
Council,
utiliser
must
notre
use our
influence et
influence
urgemment
and take
prendre des
urgent
mesures
action
pour éviter
to
une
prevent
famine et
famine
pour sauver des
and
vies.
to save
Les
lives.
solutions politiques
Political
sont urgentes.
solutions are
Il
urgently
faut un
needed.
cessez-le-feu
There must be
humanitaire
an
immédiat.
immediate humanitarian
Nous nous
ceasefire.
tenons prêts à coopérer
We
avec
stand
tous les
ready
membres
to
du
work with
Conseil
all members of this
et
Council
au-delà
and beyond
pour trouver une solution
to
qui
find a
puisse mettre
solution
fin à la
that can
souffrance humaine
end
et
human
relancer
suffering
les
and
perspectives
revive
de paix.
the prospects
Je
for
vous
peace.
remercie.
Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Madam President. I want to thank Guyana for its strong leadership during their presidency and for convening this meeting. My gratitude goes also to the representative of OCHA, FAO, and the WFP for their informative briefings. The situation in Gaza is deeply distressing, and the treatment of the Palestinian people by the occupying power is plainly inhumane. As President Abdelmajid Tebboune wisely said, you lose your dignity when you lose your food security. By December, estimate from the Integrated Phase Classification, ICP, indicated that by the end of February, all 2.2 million people in Gaza would face alarming levels of acute food insecurity, the highest ever globally. Regrettably, the efforts of the humanitarian community and the rare decision of the Security Council have not improved the situation because there were no ceasefire. Nutrition screening in the north of Gaza revealed that more than 15% of children under 2 years are accurately malnourished. It is likely that with January and February data, the situation will worsen, especially in the north, which is at this time inaccessible. Currently, 90% of children under 5 are dealing with one or more diseases while enduring extremely poor diet. Moreover, children, pregnant women, lactating mothers, and the elderly are at significantly heightened risk of mortality due to insufficient nutrition. Out of a total 97 bakeries, only 17 are operational and not in full capacity. None of them are functioning north of Wadi Gaza. Soon, very soon, no bakery will be operating in the entire Gaza Strip. A journalist from Gaza, Anas Sharif, stated, "I woke up to children screaming because of the hunger that consuming their bodies. We may tolerate hunger, but children cannot." Their screams tore our heart. Regrettably, people in Gaza are succumbing to hunger. This is not just words, but a harsh reality. The people in Gaza are facing a harrowing dilemma. They are forced to decide between the immediate threat of perishing in bombings or enduring an agonizing demise due to starvation. Madam President, faced with this appalling tragedy, the humanitarian community finds itself helpless and hopeless. And they are dealing with misinformation campaign. The current aid flow falls short, far short, of meeting the required level, and commercial activity remain completely at standstill. WFP has suspended deliveries to the north of Gaza due to safety concern for both distributor and recipients. Mothers struggle to find anything to satisfy their children's hunger, resorting to use animal fodder at the last resort. Today, why the entire population of Gaza, relying on humanitarian assistance, the Israeli occupying power is using starvation as a mean of war. I repeat, the occupying power is using starvation as a means of war. The deliberate use of starvation is a policy is a blatant violation of international law, with the intent to push the Gaza population to lose hope and dignity, and to push them to violence and to a breakdown of law and order. Madam President, let's be candid. Resolutions 2712 and 2720 of this Council are proving ineffective on the ground or with a very limited impact. Without a cessation of hostilities, ensuring adequate humanitarian assistance remains an attainable goal. The ongoing attack on Gaza is not a war against Hamas. It is a collective punishment for the Palestinian civilian people. Our silence grants a license to kill and to starve the Palestinian population. This Council must urgently call, demand for a ceasefire, as our inaction equals a complicity in this crime. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I would like to thank the briefers from OCHA, FAO, and WFP for their presentations and the sobering alert for this Council. Madam President, you chose the very good topic for your open debate a few weeks ago. It is a tragic coincidence that just a couple of weeks later, we are confronted with a live example of food insecurity and famine due to the armed conflict. Let me summarize briefings and the White Note. Gaza has become uninhabitable. The entire population of Gaza is facing high levels of acute food insecurity, the highest share ever classified worldwide. There is famine looming for people in Gaza. Vulnerable groups are significantly more susceptible to mortality due to a steep rise in malnutrition. Who are we talking about? Mohammed, 11 years, became primary food gatherer for his 6-member family, including his mother with cancer. Lynn, 2 years, diagnosed with severe acute malnutrition and drastic weight loss and muscle atrophy, weighing only half of her normal weight. Mahmoud, 2 months, died of starvation. Dear colleagues, the Security Council has received recently several powerful briefings. A chilling one of the Secretary General of Médecins Sans Frontières on the health situation. A duty of care briefing of the USG mission on safety or non-safety of the UN personnel in Gaza. Briefings by SRSGs and special envoys on Iraq, Syria, Yemen, all of them telling us of spillover effect of regional crises to their areas of responsibility. And today's note on looming famine. Which one of these briefings is a straw that will break the camel's back? The situation has been crystal clear for some time. We should all have been convinced by now that our action is needed, indeed was needed long time ago. Slovenia is deeply disturbed by the distressing evidence outlining the conflict-induced hunger and risk of famine in the White Note, and we fully support all the recommendations provided therein. We repeat once again our call for full respect for international humanitarian law and human rights law. Slovenia reiterates that international humanitarian law prohibits attacks on objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. It also strictly prohibits starvation as a method of warfare. We call for a continued, safe, secure, and unhindered humanitarian access across the entire Gaza Strip, including by opening additional crossing points and simplifying entry procedures for humanitarian aid. We call for restoration of provision of sufficient safe water supply. We regret that WFP was forced to suspend their deliveries in the north of Gaza. We reiterate our opposition on UNRWA as the lifeline for the Palestinian people and the backbone of humanitarian response in Gaza. The remainder of the White Note recommendations are to restore services for food system and food production, to restore livelihood and food production, to resume entry of essential food, water, electricity, fuel, and cooking gas, and to scale up funding for humanitarian assistance. For all these recommendations to be implemented, we need the final one, we need the 7th one, a ceasefire. and the peaceful settlement of the conflict. Only a ceasefire, which must be respected by all parties to the conflict, can guarantee the delivery of humanitarian aid without interruption, ensuring adequate, timely assistance. Madam President, the White Note and the stories of Mohammed, Lynn, and Mahmoud are the last call to this Council to change the course of action, or as one of the briefers put it, it is a matter of urgency. The main driver of hunger in Gaza is evident, and starvation of people in Gaza is preventable. Only an immediate and permanent ceasefire can avert the risk of famine. It is the only way to ensure full compliance with the Security Council Resolution 2417 on conflict and hunger. There are times when we need to make choices and we need to prioritize. Slovenia is choosing a ceasefire to prevent famine in Gaza, a ceasefire to provide relief to Palestinian people and to release hostages. Madam President, I listened carefully to our statements in this chamber. With each one of the meetings, we feel responsibility getting heavier on our shoulders. Our statements are increasingly emotional, but also clearer and more determined what needs to be done. There is a draft on the table. Let's engage seriously to see if we can square the circle, to see if our red lines can be aligned into a document that would silence the skies above Gaza and Israel and bring food to the starving Palestinians. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for his statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Director Rajasingham, Deputy Director General Martina, and Deputy Executive Director Skau for your briefings today. Our hearts go out to the thousands of families in Gaza who cannot meet their basic needs, and in this context, we welcome today's discussion under Resolution 2417. Promoting food security is a long-standing U.S. priority, and the situation in Gaza is no exception. We urge Israel to keep border crossings open for humanitarian aid to enter Gaza, to facilitate the opening of additional crossings, to meet humanitarian needs at scale, and to support the rapid, safe delivery of relief items to vulnerable people in all of Gaza. Simply put, Israel must do more. I also share your profound concern for the well-being of the more than 1 million Palestinian civilians in Rafah. It is unconscionable that Hamas fighters continue to embed themselves among civilians and civilian infrastructure, including in hospitals and schools. We caution that a major ground offensive should not proceed in Rafah under the current circumstances. We also reiterate our calls for all parties to uphold international humanitarian law. U.S. Administrator Samantha Power is in the region this week to deliver this message directly. The United States has worked tirelessly since October to reduce barriers to getting humanitarian assistance to civilians in Gaza, and will continue to do so. We worked with Egypt and Israel to open the crossing at Rafah so that trucks with food and humanitarian supplies could enter Gaza. We pressed to open Kerem Shalom to facilitate additional humanitarian assistance to civilians in Gaza. We have provided over $180 million to humanitarian organizations to deliver assistance, including food, to the people in Gaza and West Bank. We have called consistently for the protection of UN and humanitarian workers as they fulfill their critical role of ensuring that food and humanitarian supplies do not just cross into Gaza, but reach civilians in need throughout Gaza. We continue to call on Israel to improve deconfliction procedures to ensure aid can move safely and securely. We also recognize the fearless efforts of UN humanitarian workers who work under great personal danger to meet the humanitarian needs of those inside Gaza. We wholeheartedly support Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator Cog's efforts to scale up humanitarian deliveries. It is essential that Senior Coordinator COG has the resources and personnel necessary to get the job done. Let me conclude with a note on our efforts to secure the release of the hostages. It is unconscionable that Hamas and other terrorist groups continue to further this conflict while at the same time holding more than 130 hostages. We will continue to engage in intensive diplomacy with the parties to reach a hostage deal that would enable a significant temporary ceasefire, which will alleviate the suffering of the people in the Gaza Strip. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Madam President, I
I
thank Algeria, Guyana, Slovenia, and Switzerland for their initiative to convene today's meeting. I also thank the three briefers for their briefings. The UN and humanitarian agencies have played an important role in easing the humanitarian disaster in Gaza, which China fully recognizes and supports. Over 4 months since the outbreak of the conflict in Gaza, nearly 30,000 civilians have lost their lives, and Gaza has sunk into an unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe. Millions of people in Gaza are either suffering the pain of losing their loved ones or still unable to find safe shelter after multiple times of forced displacement. They lack the most basic safety guarantees and supplies for survival, and are constantly faced with the threat of death, hunger, and disease. Even more so, women and children are living in fear and desperation every single day. All this happening in Gaza seriously violates international law, international humanitarian law, and goes beyond the bottom line of human morality and conscience. The international community must take action to protect civilians, save lives, and make every effort to prevent an even greater humanitarian disaster. Madam President, humanitarian assistance is what the people in Gaza rely on for hope of survival. With a focus on protecting civilians and expanding humanitarian access, the Council has adopted resolutions 2712 and 2720. However, due to artificial obstacles, the entry of humanitarian supplies into Gaza has been faced with many difficulties. For nearly a month now, the humanitarian supplies received in Gaza have been far below the average of earlier periods, and northern Gaza has not received any humanitarian supplies. We call on Israel to earnestly fulfill its obligations as the occupying power under the Geneva Conventions, fully cooperate in the implementation of Security Council resolutions, open up all land, sea, and air access routes, and ensure the safe, rapid, and unimpeded entry of humanitarian supplies. At the same time, Israel should strictly comply with the requirements of the deconfliction mechanism, effectively guarantee the safety of humanitarian agencies and personnel, and provide necessary facilitation for humanitarian agencies to carry out assistance in Gaza. The ICJ order on provisional measures requires Israel to take all measures to prevent genocide and provide the population in Gaza with urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance. The order on provisional measures must be effectively implemented. The UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East is the lifeline for the people in Gaza. Its role is indispensable and irreplaceable. We support the UN in conducting an independent and impartial investigation into the allegations against UNRWA staff. Israel should support and cooperate with the UN in the investigation. Meanwhile, the international community should continue to support UNRWA and other humanitarian agencies in their work. We call upon the international community, and in particular the major donors, to promptly resume their funding for UNRWA. Madam President, Secretary General Guterres has pointed out on multiple occasions that with Gaza under gunfire, conditions are impossible for the delivery of humanitarian aid. An immediate ceasefire is the necessary precondition for protecting civilians, delivering assistance, and alleviating the humanitarian disaster. This is currently the overwhelming call of the international community and the overwhelming consensus among Council members. We hope that the relevant country will adopt a responsible and constructive attitude and support the Council in taking action to request immediate ceasefire in Gaza. China will continue to work with the international community in the actions to restore peace and save lives, and in the tireless efforts to end the fighting in Gaza, implement the two-state solution, and achieve lasting peace in the Middle East. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, señora Presidenta.
Thank you, Madam
Agradezco la convocatoria a esta sesión de tanta importancia.
Express gratitude for convening this session, which is so important. And I'd also like to thank the briefers of OCHA for developing the White Note, which involves an important mechanism under the early warning alert system set up in Resolution 2417. There's no doubt about the seriousness of the food insecurity. After revising the note and listening to the briefers, is there still any doubt about the gravity of the situation facing the Gaza population with regard to food insecurity? The escalation of hostilities has affected all dimensions of food security, including the collapse of local production, severe restrictions on water supplies, destruction of civilian infrastructure, and paralysis of the commercial sector. It also explains why almost the entire population finds itself at the highest levels of the integrated food security phase classification, a situation which the FAO representative qualified as unprecedented. And what's the most serious is that those that are suffering the greatest consequences of food insecurity are precisely the most vulnerable groups of people. Studies of refugee centers and healthcare centers have revealed that almost 16% of children under the age of 2 suffer from acute malnutrition, and of them, 3% suffer from the most severe form of malnutrition, which put them at greater risk of dying if they do not receive treatment urgently. Madam President, behind these alarming statistics are men and women and children who are increasingly close to famine due to the conflict. That's why Ecuador welcomes the recommendations set forth in the White Note, which highlight the link between hunger and conflict, and highlights the collective responsibility that we all share in this Council to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe. And we would like to focus our comments on 3 elements. First, interruption of the distribution of food in the north of Gaza, blockades and ongoing hostilities restrict the work of humanitarian personnel. And that is why it is urgent to allow humanitarian access, to guarantee its financing, and to fully implement Resolutions 2712 and 2720, for which a humanitarian ceasefire is key, indispensable. Secondly, preventing famines and food crises means that the parties need to respect their obligations under international humanitarian law, including the principles of humanity, distinction and proportionality, as well as the prohibition on the use of hunger as a war tactic, and prohibition on attacking civilian infrastructure, as set forth in Resolutions 2417 and 2573 of this Council. Third, measures geared to meeting the urgent humanitarian needs of the people are essential and urgent, and yet peace is the only sustainable response to the risk of hunger. That's why my country will continue to support initiatives in order to bring about a peaceful, negotiated, definitive and fair solution to the conflict with the existence of 2 states, Palestine and Israel, on the basis of the 1967 borders and the relevant resolutions. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam
je
President,
remercie
I would like to
Messieurs
thank
Rajasingham,
Mr.
Martina et Skau
Mr.
pour leur
Martina and Mr.
présentation.
Skau for their
La
briefings.
situation
The
à Gaza
situation in
est
Gaza
intolérable.
is
La faim
intolerable.
et les maladies
Hunger and
infectieuses se
infectious
propagent.
diseases are
La
spreading.
chaîne d'approvisionnement
The
alimentaire
food
est
supply
quasiment
chain
interrompue.
is
L'eau,
basically has been
l'électricité,
cut.
le carburant
Water,
font défaut.
electricity, fuel
Cette
are
situation
lacking, and
est
this
inacceptable.
is an unacceptable
Madame la
situation.
Présidente, nous sommes
Madam
réunis
President,
aujourd'hui
we
en
are here
application
today
de la
pursuant
résolution
to Resolution
2417
2417,
adoptée en
which was
2018.
adopted
Celle-ci
in
condamnait pour la
2018.
première
The
fois
resolution
l'utilisation de la
condemns for the first
famine
time the use of
comme une arme de
famine
guerre,
as a weapon of
le
war.
déni
It also
d'accès
condemns
humanitaire
the
et la
denial of
privation
humanitarian
des
access
civils de
and
biens indispensables
depriving
à
the
leur survie.
civilians of the goods
Cette
that they need for their
résolution
survival.
doit pouvoir
This
être
resolution
pleinement mise en
should
œuvre.
be fully
Tout le monde
implemented.
doit se
Everyone
conformer au droit
should
international
comply with
humanitaire,
international
Israël
humanitarian
compris.
law, including
Il est
Israel.
impératif
It is
de pouvoir
imperative
acheminer
to be
massivement
able to
l'aide
massively
dans
bring
l'ensemble de la bande de
and
Gaza,
deliver
y compris au
aid
nord.
throughout the Gaza
Israël doit
Strip,
ouvrir le
including
port
in the north.
d'Ashdod,
Israel
une
should
voie
open the
directe
port of
depuis
Ashdod,
la
the
Jordanie,
direct
et
road
tous les points de
from
passage
Jordan, and
nécessaires, la
all of the
protection des
necessary
civils, des
crossings, the
personnages
protection of
humanitaires, des
civilians,
sites des
humanitarians,
Nations
United
Unies
Nations sites,
et des autres infrastructures
and
civiles
other
est un
civilian
impératif
infrastructures
absolu.
is an absolute
La
must.
France continuera à
France
contribuer à la
will
réponse humanitaire
continue
à Gaza.
contributing to the
Elle a
humanitarian
procédé
response in
hier avec
Gaza.
la Jordanie
Yesterday,
à un nouveau
together with
largage
Jordan,
d'aide
we
ainsi qu'un
delivered a
nouvel
new
envoi de
humanitarian
fret
drop
pour
and
aider
another
les
dispatch
hôpitaux
of
égyptiens à
freight to
soigner les
help
blessés.
the Egyptian
Le
hospitals
président
treat the
Macron
ill.
l'a
The
affirmé avec
President
force,
Macron
il faut
stated
conclure
very strongly
d'urgence
that
un
we need to
accord sur un
urgently
cessez-le-feu
have an agreement
qui
on a
garantisse
ceasefire,
la
the kind of agreement
protection
which will
de tous les
guarantee the
civils
protection of
et
all
l'entrée
civilians
massive
and
de
a
l'aide
massive
d'urgence.
entry of emergency
La
assistance.
France est fermement
France
opposée
is
à une
firmly
offensive terrestre à
opposed
Rafah
to a ground
qui ne
offensive
ferait
in Rafah,
qu'aggraver encore
which
la
would
catastrophe
further
humanitaire en
compound
cours.
the current
Madame la
humanitarian
Présidente,
catastrophe.
alors que nous
Madam
appelons à un
President,
cessez-le-feu,
as we call for a
la France
ceasefire,
exige que tous les
France
otages
demands
soient
that
libérés
all hostages
immédiatement
be
et sans
freed
condition.
immediately and
Notre
unconditionally.
Conseil doit
Our
également
Council
condamner
should
les attaques
also
terroristes et les
condemn the
violences
terrorist
sexuelles
attacks and
commises par
sexual
le
violence
Hamas
committed
et
by
d'autres groupes
Hamas and
terroristes
other
le
terrorist
7
groups on
octobre.
the 7th of October.
Enfin, et
And
c'est
finally,
essentiel,
and this is
il
essential,
doit contribuer
it
sans délai
must
à
contribute
relancer
without
la
delay
construction
to
d'une
the
solution
relaunching
politique à
of a
deux États.
construction of
Je
a
vous
political
remercie.
two-state solution. I thank you.
I thank the representative of France for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And I thank OCHA for the White Note, and I thank, too, our briefers from OCHA, the FAO and the World Food Programme. Colleagues, we're witnesses to a desperate situation in Gaza, which is worsening day by day. In Rafah and the south, people are crammed into tents, if they're lucky, but without sufficient food, water, or hygiene. In North Gaza, as we've heard from the World Food Programme, humanitarian organisations cannot get aid to people who desperately need it. Hunger is at catastrophic levels. As ever, the most devastating impact falls on the most vulnerable, women and children. To address this, three things need to happen. First, we call on all parties to stop fighting immediately. This is crucial to get aid in and hostages out, and then progress towards a sustainable and permanent ceasefire. This is the only way to alleviate catastrophic hunger and suffering in Gaza. Second, we urge Israel to allow more aid into Gaza and to facilitate distribution throughout the Strip. Thousands of trucks are stuck in Egypt and Jordan, containing food, shelter, and other essentials. We need more crossings opened for longer, including Kerem Shalom. We need unencumbered access for aid coming in from Jordan. We need the full opening of Ashdod port. Key to this, too, is increasing the speed and capacity of aid screening operations, including at Kerem Shalom and Nitzana, to allow this life-saving aid to reach those who need it as soon as possible. We're particularly concerned that the World Food Programme has had to suspend deliveries into northern Gaza due to the breakdown of law and order. Airdrops cannot substitute for land-based delivery. Humanitarians need safe and unhindered access to the north through the Erez crossing now. We urge Israel to resume water and electricity supplies, which is critical for food production and safe drinking water. Commercial activity also needs to restart. Third, the UN and humanitarian partners need greater protection and access to the tools needed to accomplish their mission. This includes armoured vehicles and communications equipment, personal protective equipment, and visas. They need functioning deconfliction mechanisms and safety guarantees for locations and convoys. President, colleagues, conflict in Gaza is driving hunger. Hunger is driving a breakdown in law and order, making it impossible for aid agencies to deliver aid safely. This White Note makes clear that we need to act now. The UK calls for an immediate pause in fighting, then progress towards a sustainable ceasefire. This is the only way to avert famine and alleviate suffering. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank the briefers for their timely and heartfelt briefings on the miserable food security situation in Gaza. I feel more devastated as I realize that while we gather today in this room and hear the harsh statistics attached to the current situation, sheer numbers cannot fully describe the stark reality on the ground. Since the outbreak of the current crisis, this Council adopted 2 resolutions. Both clearly demand full, rapid, safe, and unhindered provision of humanitarian assistance, including food, to those in desperate need in Gaza. But tragically, the humanitarian situation on the ground is getting worse day by day. Ensuring provision of essential goods such as food to civilians is one of the most important rules under international humanitarian law. However, today's reality is staggering and nearly beyond belief. 90% of children under the age of 2 and 95% of pregnant and breastfeeding women in Gaza face severe food poverty, which almost always results in life-threatening undernutrition. The extreme difficulty in providing humanitarian assistance is not the only factor exacerbating food insecurity in Gaza. Resolution 2417, adopted in 2018 by this Council, urges all parties to a conflict to ensure the proper functioning of food production and distribution systems. However, the infrastructure to this end has been severely damaged and destroyed. Food security in Gaza has collapsed. To make this situation worse, civil order has completely evaporated. Under these circumstances, only 98 aid trucks entered Gaza daily in February, according to UNRWA's situation report yesterday, which is half the volume of January. If the current situation continues, the devastating outcomes will not end in this generation. Intergenerational consequences of food insecurity in Gaza are inevitable. Therefore, decisive measures must be taken as soon as possible. Above all, we must ensure consistent and expanded entry of food aid through all available crossing points as well as through a maritime corridor. Delivery of commercial goods into Gaza should also be ensured. Any hindrance to the delivery of life-saving assistance, such as the Israeli protesters at Kerem Shalom crossing, is unacceptable. Once again, we express our sincere support for the work of Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator Sigrid Kaag. We hope that her work will lead to tangible outcomes, including utilizing all the possible humanitarian routes into Gaza. There is also an increasing need to scale up funding for humanitarian aid. To participate in the international efforts to support food security in armed conflicts, the Republic of Korea has decided to increase its contribution threefold to the Central Emergency Response Fund, SURF, this year. Korea also maintains its contribution to UNRWA. Given its crucial role and the gravity of the current situation, we appreciate the effort of the Secretary General by appointing the independent review group and hope that the results of its review will come out soon. Humanitarian workers and agencies must be respected and protected by all parties, and the provision of food must be ensured in occupied territories under international humanitarian law. In addition, all parties must fully respect humanitarian notification procedures and the deconfliction mechanism to ensure the safety of humanitarian workers, most notably the staff of UNRWA. Humanitarian workers must be equipped with the necessary items, including telecommunication equipment and armored vehicles. In concluding, Madam President, we once again call for a humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. This is the only viable way to ensure safe and unimpeded access to food for those who so desperately need it. At the same time, this is the first step towards a brighter future of coexistence based on a two-state solution. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd like to start by thanking Mr. Rajasingham, Mr. Martina, and Mr. Skau for providing detailed and sobering briefings. The update on the food security risks in Gaza delivers nothing but extremely alarming facts. It is deeply distressing to discover that the entire population of 2.2 million people in Gaza will face high levels of acute food insecurity by the end of this month, and 1.1 million children in Gaza are now facing starvation. An aid worker for Save the Children on the ground saw people eating bird and animal food and tree leaves and scavenging food that has already been eaten by rats out of desperation. As indicated in the briefing, this is one of the worst food insecurity situations we have ever witnessed. To address the grave situation in Gaza, the government of Japan has announced today an additional $32 million in emergency grant aid to provide assistance in the fields of food and health, among others. I wish to underscore 3 points that are most critical to prevent conflict-induced famine and widespread food insecurity in Gaza. First, all parties to the conflict must respect international humanitarian law. International humanitarian law clearly prohibits attacking, destroying, removing, or rendering useless objects that are indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. These include foodstuffs, agricultural areas, crops, livestock, drinking water installations and supplies, and irrigation works. IHL also requires parties to the conflict to allow and facilitate rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian assistance for civilians. This message has been numerously repeated inside and outside of this chamber, but we will continue to repeat this call until we see these rules are followed. Second, more humanitarian aid coordination between relevant parties is needed to meet the enormous humanitarian requirements on the ground. WFP recently announced that they have been forced to pause food distributions in northern Gaza, and many other humanitarian organizations are echoing the difficulties in delivering aid. It is vital to allow more trucks and fuel to reach Gaza, and we urge Israel to open additional border crossings and secure humanitarian corridors so that humanitarian actors can safely carry out their work. We also strongly support the efforts of UN Senior Coordinator Ms. Sigrid Kaag to overcome the many impediments to reaching those in need. Finally, even as we demand the remedy of the humanitarian situation, we must continue our efforts to address the cause of this catastrophe. In this vein, Japan once again unequivocally condemns the heinous acts of terror by Hamas and others on October 7th, which has led to a series of tragedies. We demand the immediate and unconditional release of all remaining hostages held by Hamas and other groups. At the same time, Japan also reiterates that the humanitarian ceasefire needs to be realized promptly to ensure a conducive environment for sufficient humanitarian assistance activities, as well as to lead to the release of the remaining hostages, therefore resulting in the realization of a sustainable ceasefire. Based on this position, Japan calls on all the parties concerned to act immediately from a humanitarian viewpoint. Madam President, this humanitarian catastrophe must be immediately stopped. Japan will continue to work with other Council members and the international community to alleviate the plight of the people in Gaza. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Japan for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Madam President, I thank you for convening this meeting on this very critical topic. I also thank Mr. Rajasingham, Mr. Martina, and Mr. Skau for their briefings and the context provided. The recent updates on the harsh realities of life in the Gaza Strip are deeply distressing. The persistent hostilities in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank are having far-reaching consequences on the innocent civilian population, who are already impacted by structural economic deprivation and economic challenges resulting from the 16-year blockade and restriction of Israel on the occupied Palestinian territory. In line with Resolution 2417, and in a genuine effort to protect civilians, OCHA has brought to the attention of this Council the imminent risk of conflict-induced famine and widespread food insecurity due to the ongoing war in the Gaza Strip. The integrated phase classification in their December 2023 special brief also highlighted the magnitude of acute food insecurity that has in reality currently exposed almost 2.2 million Palestinians to severe hunger, the highest level ever classified worldwide. We remain deeply concerned that the ongoing violence is hindering an effective humanitarian response to civilians in need, and therefore a major cause of the current risk of mortality due to inadequate nutrition by vulnerable groups such as children, pregnant and lactating women, persons with disabilities, the aged, etc. Madam President, we fully subscribe to the view that this situation has been driven by the direct impact of the military operations in Gaza, resulting in a decline in the health and density of arable land, destruction of agricultural infrastructure, diminishing food production, markets and supply chain, and hindering the entry and delivery of humanitarian and commercial food supplies into and within the Gaza Strip. The 1.7 million internally displaced persons who cannot access or cultivate the land are deprived of enough food and water desperately needed for their survival. According to UNICEF, children in southern Gaza could only access 1.5 to 2 liters of water per day, a portion way below the standard requirements for survival. With the collapse of the health system in the entire Gaza Strip, health conditions exacerbated by lack of enough water and food, could not be treated in time and appropriately. The sight of children dying in the Gaza Strip because of hunger is harrowing at best, and this Council cannot afford for this situation to continue without using the myriads of tools available to address it. Given the above instances, and in an effort to fully implement the provisions of Resolution 2417, Sierra Leone therefore calls strongly for the following actions. Firstly, to eliminate the risk of famine, disease, and high mortality rates in the Gaza Strip and the entire territory of Palestine, Sierra Leone reiterates its call for the parties to conflict to comply with their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law that prohibits the use of starvation of civilians as a method of warfare and the destruction of civilian objects necessary for storing and distributing relief assistance indispensable to the survival of the entire population. Secondly, we reiterate the need for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire and reject any attempt to conduct military operations in Rafah, the southern region of Gaza, where a greater percentage of the land is arable and could enhance famine, as reported by OCHA. Thirdly, we call on parties to the conflict to allow for safe and unimpeded access to humanitarian aid through the opening of all relevant crossings into the Gaza Strip, especially to the northern Gaza. We further call for a functioning humanitarian notification system and a stable communication network that will guarantee the protection of United Nations and other humanitarian personnel and enhance the efficient delivery of essential commodities. We reiterate the exceptional role played by UNRWA and stress that inadequate funding and further restrictions in their operations obstruct efficient service delivery, which is currently below average. In closing, Sierra Leone stresses the need for the requisite support to be granted to Ms. Sigrid Kaag, Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza, in our effort to improve the delivery of humanitarian assistance to the Gaza Strip. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Thank you, President. Madam President, Mozambique commends the Guyana Presidency for convening this timely open briefing on the protections of civilians in armed conflicts, with a specific focus on the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. We extend our appreciation to the briefers, Mr. Rajasingham, Director of Coordination of United Nations Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, Mr. Martina, Assistant Director General of Food and Agriculture Organization of United Nations, and Mr. Carl, Deputy Director Executive of United Nations for World Food Program, for their insightful information to the Council. Madam President, the situation in the Middle East, including the occupied territories of Palestine, remains deeply concerning. It is therefore crucial that the international community continues to address the challenges faced by civilians caught in the midst of armed conflict. The intensifications and expansions of attacks in the Gaza Strip has been the cause of enormous humanitarian damage, including massive civilian death, millions of injuries, and forced displacement, as well as the destruction of infrastructures. The catastrophic situation on the ground, coupled with anger crisis, call for urgent and effective measures to minimize the loss of human lives and upholding of values and humanitarian dignity and solidarity. Madam President, the protection of civilians in situations of armed conflict is a cornerstone of international humanitarian law. In this respect, the UN Security Council Resolution 2417 on the protection of civilians in armed conflict, adopted unanimously on 24th May 2018, reaffirms the primary responsibility of states to protect the population throughout their whole territory. In the present case, the urgency is highlighted by the Israeli military action and by the threat of an Israel ground offensive in Rafah, where approximately 1.5 million people are seeking shelter. In this regard, we call for a global and effective measures, not only to protect the civilians in Gaza region, but also to enable the provision of needed basic services and humanitarian assistance to address adverse conditions of life faced by Palestinian civilians in the Gaza Strip. To this end, an immediate and urgent cessation of hostilities is crucial. Mozambique reiterates its call for this Council to stand united and committed in implementation of all Security Council resolutions and UN legal instruments regarding the end of violence and protection of civilians in the Gaza Strip. Madam President, Mozambique wishes to reaffirm the importance and urgency of two-state solution for peace and stability in the Middle East in accordance with international law, Security Council, and the General Assembly resolutions. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Madam President,
признательны делегациям Алжира, Гаяны, Словении, Швейцарии за
Switzerland for convening our meeting today.
Благодарим
We also would
представителей
like to thank the
КГВ,
representatives of OCHA,
Всемирной продовольственной
World
программы и
Food
ФАО
Program
за
and
честные
FAO. We thank
оценки
them for the honest assessment
катастрофической
of the
ситуации в
disastrous
области продовольственной
situation
безопасности в
in
секторе
Gaza
Газа.
in the area of food security.
Мы внимательно
We
ознакомились
read
с
very
запиской
carefully
КГВ,
the OCHA White
подготовленной в
Note, which
соответствии с
was
резолюцией
prepared
Совета
pursuant to
Безопасности
Security Council Resolution
2417.
2417.
На наш взгляд,
In
эта записка,
our
конечно,
view, the
опоздала.
note was somewhat late in coming.
Тревожный прогноз
Because the
по
worrying
сектору Газа был
forecast on
анонсирован
Gaza
еще в декабре
was
прошлого года в
voiced
рамках
in December
интегрированной
last year
классификации
already
фаз
within the
продовольственной
framework of the
безопасности.
Integrated Food Security Phase
По
Classification
оценкам,
Brief.
которые мы услышали и сегодня,
According to the
риск
assessments we heard today,
полномасштабного
the
голода
risk of a
возрастает
full-scale
каждый день.
famine is growing daily.
По практике выпуск
Practice
таких
show that
документов
when such
является
documents
красной
are
чертой.
issued, they constitute a red
Перешагнув ее
line.
в контексте
If
Газа при
we
отсутствии
cross it
действенной
in
реакции,
Gaza
члены
and
Совета
have no
Безопасности
substantive reaction
разделят
to
всю
it, then
полноту
members of Security
ответственности за
Council will
использование
share
Израилем
full
голода в качестве
responsibility for the
метода
fact that
ведения войны.
Israel is using hunger as a method of war.
От приведенных в отчете КГВ данных
When you
виднеет,
read the note, it
никак
makes your
иначе
blood run
нельзя
cold. That's the only
характеризовать
characteristic
трагическую
that we could
статистику,
give to the
согласно
tragic
которой
statistics, according to which out of 2.2 million Gazans who are experiencing acute food security, at least 600,000 people. In other words, every fourth Gazan is a step away from death from hunger. This is the highest share of people encountering acute hunger ever registered in the world. It is very difficult to acknowledge that this is not something that's happening in the Middle Ages, but in 2024 in front of our eyes.
Gaza
is suffering from water shortages, and the children in the strip are only receiving 1.5 to 2 liters of water per day, which is considerably lower than the survival level. According to UNICEF, in addition to hunger, at least 90% of children under 5 in Gaza have one or more diseases they're suffering from. As we learned from the White Note, because of malnutrition, a whole generation of Gaza children is at the risk of having irreparable physical or cognitive capacities undermined. In other words, this is a death blow to the future of Gaza. But do our Western colleagues, are they concerned with the fate of Palestinian children? It's very difficult not to ask that question against the background of Western insinuations when it comes to Ukrainian children, whom Russia is actually saving, against the background of numerous propaganda activities in this regard that Western delegations hold. I'd like to ask my Western colleague, has there been one single activity, meeting devoted to the children of Gaza, who, according to UN data, are doomed? Or are you not concerned with that at all, because this will not allow you to score any propaganda point against Russia? Madam President, colleagues, everyone knows that there is no issue with availability of assistance for Gaza. Members of the Security Council could see that with their own eyes during the visit of the Council to the border of Gaza last year. Convoys of aid-laden trucks stand ready to go to Rafah, carrying everything that's needed. But as we know, the stringent measures of Israel resulted in exactly the opposite situation. Because of bureaucratic impediments and access denial, there's a minimal amount of assistance, and it only goes to the south. The north is the area where the humanitarians cannot conduct their humanitarian supplies because of insecurity, and we can only guess what the situation is that's being experienced by the people who live there. In this context, it's futile to be talking about any kind of a potential for local agriculture. There are no conditions for that. There is high danger from the mines. There is environmental pollution of very narrow farmlands. There's no water for their irrigation, and this leaves the Gazans with no hope that they will reach their own food self-sufficiency. Let's recall what kind of hopes were pinned on Security Council Resolution 2720. That resolution, as we were then told, were called upon to drastically change the situation in the area of humanitarian supplies. For this purpose, the Secretary General was tasked with appointing a senior humanitarian coordinator, and that's Sigrid Kaag. But weak wordings allowing for various interpretations when it comes to hostilities which were brought into the text to accommodate Washington only compounded the situation, and we had warned the Council about that. The only vital imperative thing to prevent mass starvation in Gaza is an immediate ceasefire and making sure that Israel complies with international humanitarian law. This is an appeal that was issued by the Secretary General and OCHA leadership on many occasions. But all attempts by the Council to pass such a decision were blocked by the United States. They have used their veto 4 times for that purpose. Against the background of tens of thousands of dead and starving in Gaza, the American delegation continues saying that a ceasefire would, according to them, be even dangerous because it will undermine some fragile U.S. diplomacy on the ground. By blocking international efforts to stop violence in Gaza, Washington bears full responsibility for the unprecedented number of civilian victims of this escalation. Their number is now near 30,000, and that is the cost of the American veto in the Security Council on Gaza. The alternative American draft resolution in Security Council on Gaza does not contain an appeal for a ceasefire and is aimed at broadening the UN umbrella to the acts of Israel. This is not an alternative. This is yet another license to kill, which the United States want to give to Israel, but this time have a Security Council signature on it. I call on members of the Council not to support this destructive initiative. Colleagues, the White Note issued by OCHA pursuant to Resolution 2414 does not give the Security Council any options other than striving for a ceasefire so as to create the conditions which are necessary for the humanitarians and healthcare workers. And we are going to do exactly that. This is important first and foremost to create safe, continuously working humanitarian corridors. And this is something that was mentioned on many times by WHO. In addition to assistance supplies through that, what we need to do is to evacuate the seriously ill who, in the absence of medicines, would inevitably die in Gaza. We also have to remember that according to provisions of the resolution I just mentioned, when it comes to obstructing humanitarian assistance for the needy, the Security Council has the right to consider adopting sanction measures. And I think that now the time is ripe to activate this provision. Madam President, in conclusion, I must draw your attention to the fact that there are no other Western delegations, including United States and closest satellites, and those who requested the meeting. When they presided in August last year, they spent a signature meeting on food security. But everything that Washington was interested in at the time is to try and sting Russia by spreading legends that Russia supposedly bears a responsibility with food supply issues that the international community encountered. Our Western colleagues, even at the time, invented and continued repeating the term, which was using hunger as a weapon. And I call on everyone who in this meeting today to note that today neither the United States nor the UK, they did not use this term, not even once, to describe what is being done by Israel in Gaza. This speaks for itself. What is also speaks for itself is the fact that we are not seeing the Western states here under Rule 37, the states, the European ministers who besieged the Security Council last week, trying to come to the ritual meeting on the Ukrainian crisis. Is famine in Gaza is less important topic for the EU, which claims that they main humanitarian and human rights advocate in the world, or are the Gazans, the Syrians, the Afghani, the Yemenis, are second-class people whose life is of no concern to those who inhabit the beautiful European garden. It looks this way. Let me give you another shocking example. Is the alacrity with which a number of Western donors, before even the investigation is conducted, suspended UNRWA funding, and this is in the middle of humanitarian disaster in Gaza, which means that the agency is on the brink of collapse. It is difficult to see this as anything other than an open, immoral donor blackmail and politicizing of humanitarian issues. We expect that the Council will, in the upcoming days, have an opportunity to separately discuss this issue. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation, and I give the floor now to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. I also thank OCHA, FAO, and WFP for the important briefings. As has been made clear, Gaza continues to endure devastating food insecurity. Nearly 600,000 people are on the brink of famine. This catastrophic level of food insecurity is a direct result of Israel's military campaign and Israel's inability to abide by its legal obligations and facilitate the unimpeded delivery of humanitarian assistance and food aid into the Strip. This is a matter of urgency. We call for the reopening of Port Ashdod. Further crossing points must reopen immediately to allow adequate scaling up of aid. An effective humanitarian deconfliction mechanism, respected by all parties, as called for in Resolution 2712, is also fundamental. The risks of those falling into starvation increase with each day. With each day that the intense fighting persists and humanitarian access remains hampered and restricted. A permanent ceasefire is crucial, now more than ever, to allow for the necessary space for a scaled-up humanitarian intervention, including to address this conflict-induced food insecurity. Food production capacity in Gaza and the ability for people to access food have been severely hampered. This is also due to restrictions on delivery of commercial supplies. Vast swaths of crucial arable land have been destroyed as a result of the months-long intense military campaign, and agricultural infrastructure has suffered severe damage. In addition, 1.7 million people have been forcibly displaced, leading to abandonment of inaccessibility to means of food production. Malta firmly rejects and denounces any forced displacement of Palestinians from their lands or homes, including from and within Gaza. Israel's electricity blackout on Gaza and restrictions on fuel further impede food production. Water supplies and desalination plants have also been severely compromised. As outlined in Resolution 2417, parties to armed conflict must refrain from attacking, destroying, removing, or rendering useless those objects that are indispensable for the survival of the civilian population. Israel must protect and restore vital infrastructure and services needed for food systems and food production. These include cross-border water pipelines, telecommunications, and the resumption of electricity and fuel distribution. Malta is also greatly disturbed by public statements expressing the intent to deprive civilians in Gaza of food, water, and fuel. Starvation cannot be used as a weapon of war. We also reiterate that UNRWA's presence remains essential to ensure an effective humanitarian response in Gaza. Its role is irreplaceable. As the backbone of the humanitarian response in Gaza and a stabilizing force in the region, further funding cuts will undermine critical humanitarian action. President, children in Gaza continue to bear the brunt of the suffering. 90% of the children under 5 are experiencing one or more infectious disease due to food poverty and lack of access to clean water. 1 in 6 children under the age of 2 in northern Gaza are acutely malnourished and experiencing wasting. Thousands have been forced to become the primary food gatherers for their families, putting themselves in the line of fire to feed their loved ones. These conditions threaten an entire generation. Malnutrition in childhood causes irreparable physical and cognitive impairments. In conclusion, President, this Council must demand that immediate action be taken by the parties to ensure compliance with international humanitarian law, including Resolution 2417. Accountability for violations of international law must be prioritized. We also call for the immediate implementation of the order on provisional measures issued by the ICJ, including those measures related to the provision of humanitarian assistance into the Gaza Strip. Above all, a permanent ceasefire must be agreed as a matter of urgency to allow for unimpeded delivery of multi-sectorial humanitarian assistance at scale. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for her statement. The representative of the United States has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give him the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. I apologize for taking the floor. I just need to respond to some comments made by the representative of the Russian Federation. I think my remarks on the horrible situation in Gaza were quite clear. I would just remind everyone in this room that the Russian Federation is a country that doesn't contribute to resolving humanitarian crises. It creates them. Just look at Ukraine, and don't take my word for it. Ask the Ukrainian people that have to live under the savage, barbaric bombings and killings that they have to deal with every single day. So Russia is in no position, frankly, to criticize any country while it continues to flagrantly and relentlessly violate the UN Charter. So when I hear Russia speak about its concerns about civilian infrastructure, et cetera, it is hard to take what it says seriously. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States for his statement, and the Russian Federation has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give him the floor.
Благодарю вас, госпожа председатель. Я просто хотел ответить своему американскому коллеге. Вы постыдились сравнивать ситуацию на Украине и в Газе. Они несравнимы.
Can't be compared.
Как вы утверждаете, Российская Федерация не подвергает варварским бомбардировкам гражданское население.
Unlike what you say, the Russian Federation is not bombing the civilian population of Ukraine barbarically. That was first. And second, comparing the scale of it is impossible. And second of all, who should be lecturing us about that? The country who destroyed Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and carpet bombed in barbaric way those countries, Yugoslavia also on that list. list. So before you next try to see a mote in my eye, you should see the beam in yours.
I thank the representative of Russia for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the U.S. to make a further statement.
Thank you, Madam President. I apologize again. First and foremost, I was not making a comparison of the two. I was pointing out what Russia has been doing. And so I would just have a quick question for the Russian permanent representative. Are you saying that Russia is not conducting any bombings of Ukraine? Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for his statement, and I give the floor for a final comment by the Russian Federation.
I'll be very brief, Madam President, and I propose that we do not turn the Security Council into a duel between the United States and the Russian Federation. We have addressed the situation and will address the situation in Ukraine and have stated on many an occasion then what are the targets that are being attacked by the Russian armed forces. Military targets, military infrastructure targets, which enable the Kiev regime to keep their military machine. And I hope I propose that we stop here and we continue our sparring during the meeting on Ukraine.
Thank the representative of the Russian Federation, and I now give the floor to the representative of the observer state of Palestine.
Madam President, we thank you for responding to Algiers' request for this urgent meeting, and thank Guyana, Slovenia, and Switzerland for also supporting the request in follow-up to the White Note on the food insecurity crisis in the Gaza Strip issued by the Secretary General pursuant to Resolution 2417. We also thank the three briefers from OCHA, FAO, and WFP for their briefings. In that resolution 2417, the Security Council condemned both starvation of civilians as a method of warfare and the unlawful denial of humanitarian access to civilian populations in urgent need of food and livelihood assistance, and required the Secretary General to report swiftly to the Council when the risk of conflict-induced famine and widespread food insecurity occurs in situations of armed conflict. In issuing this White Note, the Secretary General has again acted with the responsibility and seriousness compelled by this grave situation, as he did when he invoked Article 99, imploring the Council to act in the face of the threats to peace and security caused by Israel's war on Gaza. These actions follow on his early and continual calls for a humanitarian ceasefire as an utmost priority to stop the bloodshed and protect Palestinian civilians in Gaza who have suffered unprecedented losses, with casualties now surpassing 30,000 Palestinians killed and 70,000 people wounded, the majority women and children, and many more lives endangered by Israelis' weapons and medical siege on Gaza that have inflicted massive displacement and a wildfire spread of hunger, disease, and despair among the population. Madam President, in early December 2023, 3 months into this genocidal war, the World Food Programme reported that 97% of families in northern Gaza were struggling with hunger. 9 out of 10 people were enduring a full day and night without food. some for days on end. By early February 2024, a joint WFP and FAO report on food security in Palestine indicated that Gaza's entire population was suffering acute food insecurity, the highest share of people ever classified as such for any given area or country. That IPC estimates are actually deemed conservative should be a matter of alarm for this Council. Food insecurity in Gaza has in fact reached catastrophic levels, with over 500,000 people considered to be one step away from famine. In reality, a famine is underway, worsening every day that Israel carries on with this criminal aggression. An entire population has been stripped of its dignity and means for survival, rendered completely dependent on humanitarian aid, which is tragically not reaching them. This is in spite of the Council's efforts in Resolution 2712 and 2720, including the appointment of a senior humanitarian and reconstruction coordinator for Gaza, Ms. Sigrid Kaag, to ensure the acceleration, scaling up, and distribution of aid. But we all know that without a ceasefire, this has become mission impossible, as Israelis continues to rain down bombs and missiles and to obstruct crossings point and entry of trucks, leaving millions of people hungry and desperate. We must stop for a moment and consider what this truly means. What it feels like to be without food for days. Imagine just one day without a morsel of food in your stomach. Maybe 2 days without a piece of bread in your stomach. What the pain of such hunger feels like, the havoc starvation wreaks on the human body and mind, and no less in combination with the trauma of having to run from one place to another, forcibly displaced over and over, with nowhere safe for refuge, and all while hungry and depleted. What it means to forage for a food in the rubble, sand, and trash, to eat animal feed or food ravaged by rats in order to survive. The absolute dispersion and indignation. What it means for mothers and fathers to hear their babies and children cry for hunger day and night, no milk, no bread, nothing. The fact is that children, women and men are being left to starve, wasting away, as a result of Israelis' calculated, sinister decisions to lay siege to Gaza, 17 years of blockade and its savage military aggression. After bombing nearly every bakery and farm, destroying livestock and all means of food production, and its closure of nearly all crossing points, the occupier claims that it is allowing humanitarian aid to enter Gaza and that there is no problem. And that's what we might hear from them later on. But we all know the truth. It is only allowing a drip of aid into Gaza, only to deflect international opprobrium and with no regard whatsoever for the well-being or survival of the population that it has made clear time and again that it wants to get rid of. Babies have been born and have died. In the span of these few months, living the entirety of their short lives in the horrors of this genocide, some dying in incubators, side by side with other babies, deprived of sustenance and medical care, some dying of hunger and hypothermia in the arms of their mothers, some orphaned and left to fend for themselves in this nightmare. Israel is the architect of this human and humanitarian catastrophe, which it has purposely designed to collectively punish Gaza's 2.3 million Palestinians, half of whom are children, in grave breach of international law and any standard of decency or morality. Israeli officials have said it openly. They are going to teach Palestinians in Gaza a lesson, and they are doing so willfully and wantonly, violating international humanitarian law, international human rights law, Security Council and General Assembly resolutions, and the ICJ Provisional Measures Order in the case brought by South Africa against Israel under the Genocide Convention with total contempt. Israel has completely ignored the ICJ order and continues with its appalling genocidal crimes, including the crime of starvation as a method of war. This is not an opinion. It is thoroughly evidenced in reports of UN humanitarian agencies and many international humanitarian and human rights organizations, almost unanimously, that this catastrophic famine and genocide has been allowed to happen at all and allowed to continue for this long brings shame on all of us, not least this Security Council that continues to fail to demand a ceasefire and ensure respect for international law and for its own resolutions, leaving the Palestinian people to the mercy of the occupying power that has zero regard for its IHL obligations to ensure the safety and well-being of the civilian population under its control, choosing instead to terrorize, kill, maim, displace, and starve them. Israel's weaponization of food to punish the Palestinian people is not a secret. It was declared months ago, in October 2023, by the highest-ranking Israeli government and military officials, some of whom continue bragging about such punitive policies, with some publicly stating that such policies will hasten the decline of humanitarian conditions and provoke a mass exodus from Gaza or voluntary, quote-unquote, migration of this demographic threat, as they cynically called our people. Thus, its use of starvation as a weapon goes hand in hand with its policies aimed at the forced transfer of our people from their land, which Israel has pursued by all means since the start of this genocidal war. its threatened invasion of Rafah, highlighting real fears in this regard. It is these same officials who continue to incite and collude with Israeli citizens who amass daily to block the entry of aid trucks to Gaza, some so depraved that they bring their children with them and offer popcorn, candy, and play structures in a festive atmosphere as they knowingly prevent food from reaching a starving population, including over 1 million Palestinian children. It is these same officials who, in addition to permitting the targeting and killing of humanitarian personnel by Israeli occupying forces, are waging an all-out assault on UNRWA, part of Israel's long-running propaganda campaign aimed at libeling UNRWA and undermining donor support in an attempt to bring it to a collapse, to continue their efforts to erase the Palestine refugee question. The fact is that starving UNRWA of funds based on the alleged, still unproven acts of a few among tens of thousands of UNRWA staff members means starving desperate Palestine refugees and displaced families in Gaza of its life-saving aid and depriving our refugees across the region of its indispensable assistance, gravely harming them and dangerously destabilizing the host countries and region as a whole. Moreover, doing so while at the same failing to pursue accountability for Israel's blatant war crimes and crimes against humanity exposes painful double standards. We thus appeal to donor countries that have suspended funding to reconsider their decisions and the massive impact they will have, compounding the collective punishment of the Palestinian people and their already unbearable suffering. Madam President, Israel's use of starvation as a method of warfare has become one of the main tools in its genocidal arsenal against the Palestinian people. This is a fact that cannot be ignored and for which there must be immediate accountability. What has been sown by Israelis' extremist, far-right leaders within Israeli society that foments and enables such dehumanization and such war crimes and crimes against humanity must be stopped. This Council must uphold its responsibilities in accordance with the Charter, with its resolution on the Palestine question and on the protection of civilians, including Resolution 2417 of the year 2018, which calls upon all states to uphold international humanitarian law in conflict and ensure accountability for mass atrocity crimes. No one should be complicit in this genocide. I repeat, no one should be complicit in this genocide. Those who know their actions and omissions will deprive the Palestinian people of the means for survival, including access to food and water, and those who fail to act to hold Israel accountable, even as it wages genocide, lose the moral high ground and any credibility. Rectifying this abhorrent situation, Madam President, thus requires three immediate steps. One, a ceasefire now. I repeat, a ceasefire now, as millions in the streets are repeating every day for politicians in capitals to listen to them. Ceasefire now. To halt the Israeli aggression, to stop the invasion of Rafah, stop the bloodshed and stop further displacement of the Palestinian civilian population. 2, the unimpeded, accelerated delivery of humanitarian aid at scale throughout all of Gaza, including the north, and the entry of commercial goods. And 3, accountability measures for all the war crimes and crimes against humanity perpetrated by Israel, imperiling the survival of our people and destroying the prospects for a just peace. Accountability measures that should include practical measures, and punishment for all those who are committing these crimes against the Palestinian people. And also, you should, all of you, stop sending weapons and ammunition, among other things, to Israel to continue committing these crimes against our people. As I said, destroying the prospect for a just peace that leads to the end of occupation and the independence of the State of Palestine on the borders of the 4th of June of 1967 with East Jerusalem as its capital. We once again appeal to the Security Council to act, and to act forthwith immediately. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you for convening today's debate. I'm certain that there isn't a single person in this room today who wishes to allow any child to go hungry. Not one of us desires any civilian to lack these basic needs. And this is precisely Israel's stance. While combating Hamas, a terror group that adheres to no rules, regulations, or norms other than their intent to murder and terrorize Jews, Israel is doing all it can to care for civilians, going above and beyond what is expected, let alone required. Israel is committed to improving the humanitarian situation in Gaza, working constantly to ensure the entry of humanitarian aid from numerous countries and UN agencies. Israel facilitates the entry of humanitarian aid, including food, water, medical supplies, and humanitarian supplies, through both the Rafah and Kerem Shalom crossings. Additionally, a humanitarian aid delivery channel via Jordan is operational, and more delivery channels are being formulated and discussed as we sit here today. Since Hamas's barbaric attack on October 7th, and despite this atrocity, Israel has facilitated the delivery of 254,000 tons of humanitarian aid, including shelter equipment, water, medical supplies, and of this, 165,000 tons of food. Israel has been clear in its policies. There is absolutely no limit, and I repeat, there is no limit to the amount of humanitarian aid that can be sent to the civilian population of Gaza. And Israel continues to coordinate the transfer of aid in accordance with humanitarian organizations' requests and the operational conditions in the field. Since the beginning of 2024, the majority of aid requests were approved. 83% of coordinated movements to facilitate aid were approved, and 16% were denied due to the imminent security risks that the shipments posed should they end up in the hands of Hamas terrorists. Of the approved coordinated movements, 18% were either not carried out or cancelled by the coordinating organizations themselves. These are the facts. No one can claim otherwise. Thanks to Israel's efforts, and despite the continued attacks by Hamas, 20 bakeries are fully operational throughout Gaza. This is made possible through the entry of large quantities of flour, daily shipments of cooking gas, and supply of diesel fuel for generators. These bakeries produce over 2 million pita breads per day. Madam President, if we are truly interested in improving the situation, if we are truly interested in helping those who suffer, we must address what is truly hampering further advancements. The claims made today by some of the briefers neglected to fully address the two true obstacles to both peace and stability, and also to the prosperity of Gazans themselves. Some of the briefers' claims are intended to divert the focus from an ongoing failure in handling and managing the distribution of aid to those in need, and also serves to propagate Hamas lies. The limitations on the quantity and pace of aid are dependent on the capacity of the United Nations and other agencies to receive, store, and distribute the assistance efficiently. In recent days, over 500 aid trucks have been waiting on the Gazan side of Kerem Shalom and Rafah crossings. It is not Israel who is holding up these trucks. They have already been approved. So where is the UN and its aid agencies? How can it be that Israel is libelously held responsible for a situation that is clearly the UN's fault? The conduct of the UN in the field must be streamlined and humanitarian aid must be distributed more effectively. This is the solution. Israel is committed to improving the humanitarian situation in the northern part of Gaza as well. Accordingly, yesterday Israel permitted and facilitated the airdrops of 64 Jordanian and French food packages throughout northern Gaza. The UN, on the other hand, has refused to deliver aid to this area. UN agencies' decision to suspend the distribution of aid to northern Gaza is not only counterproductive, but harmful to the Palestinian civilian population, and it also used as yet another way to demonize Israel. This is not how to improve this humanitarian situation. Israel calls to optimize the work of the UN agencies in a means that will improve the reception of the aid within Gaza Strip as well as its distribution. This is the only way to ensure the overall improvement of the humanitarian situation. The problem of aid diversion within Gaza must not and cannot be neglected. Neither should the theft and looting by Hamas be ignored. Humanitarian corridors, water lines, and communications infrastructures have come under attack by Hamas, yet not once are these blatant aggressions addressed in this Council. Madam President, for decades, Israel has warned about Hamas's entrenchment in Gaza. Sadly, we have been widely ignored by the international community, and this esteemed Council continues to do so now. It is vital and long overdue that the Security Council speak out and condemn Hamas's use of human shields and its building of tunnels under civilian infrastructure. It is also vital that the Council address Hamas's systematic diversion of humanitarian aid intended for the Palestinian people and act to prevent it. Israel will continue to do all in its power to ensure that the aid delivered via the Rafah crossing and Kerem Shalom is not seized and exploited for terror. Madam President, while humanitarian aid continues to enter Gaza, 134 hostages still have not come out. Hamas continues to hold children, women, men and the elderly in their dark terror tunnels. Yet while this Council is so keen to focus solely on the protection of Gazan civilians in this conflict, our hostages are hardly an afterthought. Israel is still waiting for the UN to dedicate a meeting to the protection of Israeli hostages in armed conflict. Tragically, knowing this body, we may remain waiting for a very long time. Nevertheless, we will not be silent, nor will we be idle. Israel will continue to demand the immediate and unconditional release of all our hostages, and we call upon this Council to do everything in its power to ensure their safety and well-being. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Israel for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Tunisia.
شكرا السيدة الرئيسة.
أتشرف
بإلقاء هذا البيان باسم المجموعة العربية. وأود في البداية أن أشكر وفدكم ووفود الجزائر وسويسرا وسلوفينيا على المبادرة بعقد هذه الجلسة الهامة في هذا الظرف الدقيق الذي يشهد بوادر مجاعة تخيم على قطاع غزة. كما أشكر مقدمي الإحاطات على بياناتهم التي عكست وللأسف مدى خطورة الوضع الإنساني الذي يعيشه الشعب الفلسطيني في غزة، لا سيما حالة الجوع التي بلغت مستويات غير مسبوقة وتهدد بوقوع كارثة إنسانية. السيد الرئيس، للأسف نلتقي مرة أخرى في ظل تواصل المأساة الإنسانية في غزة بسبب عجز المجموعة الدولية عن إقرار وقف فوري لإطلاق النار وإصرار قوات الاحتلال على الاستمرار في تنفيذ مخططاتها وتعميق معاناة الشعب الفلسطيني الذي يتعرض منذ 5 أشهر لشتى أنواع العدوان والتنكيل وجرائم الإبادة الجماعية وليس أقلها التجويع ومنع المساعدات الإنسانية والغذاء والدواء والماء. تشير آخر الإحصائيات وتقارير المنظمات الأممية والإنسانية إلى انتشار الجوع وسوء التغذية على نطاق واسع في قطاع غزة، والذي تسبب في عديد الوفيات خاصة في صفوف الأطفال والمرضى وكبار السن، كما اضطر السكان إلى اللجوء إلى أكل الأعلاف والنباتات في حين تتكدس مئات الشاحنات المحملة بالمساعدات الإنسانية عند المعابر والتي لم تتمكن من الدخول لإنقاذ أرواح أكثر من 2 مليون فلسطيني بسبب منعها واستهدافها من قبل قوات الاحتلال. ورغم هذا الوضع الكارثي فإن مسؤولي حكومة الاحتلال ما زالوا يكررون تهديداتهم بمواصلة منع هذه المساعدات وبتشديد إجراءات الحصار التجويعي والإبادة الصامتة على الشعب الفلسطيني وحرمانه من كل وسائل البقاء في انتهاك صارخ لحقوق الإنسان وللقانون الدولي الإنساني. السيد الرئيس، لا يمكن للمجموعة الدولية ومجلس الأمن أن يواصل السكوت على جرائم الحرب هذه وجرائم الإبادة التي يتعرض لها الشعب الفلسطيني سواء بالحرب المدمرة التي تستهدفه بلا هوادة أو بالحصار والتجويع أو بالتهجير القسري، وكلها ممارسات مدانة ومرفوضة بقرارات مجلس الأمن نفسه وبالمواثيق الدولية والإنسانية. إن أعداد الضحايا والجرحى والمشردين والمهددين ليست مجرد أرقام وإحصائيات نكررها ونحيينها في كل اجتماع ونمضي، إنما هي أرواح تزهق ومآس تتعمق ومعاناة تتفاقم وعنوان عجز وفشل للمجموعة الدولية ولمجلس الأمن أساسا. لن أتساءل متى سيتحرك المجلس ويتحمل مسؤوليته بعيدا عن الحسابات السياسية، وكم فلسطينيا يجب أن يقتل، وغيرها من التساؤلات التي لم تجد إلى الآن إجابة. أقول فقط إن ما يجري تحت أنظار العالم وفي ظل هذا الصمت المريب وصمة عار وسابقة خطيرة، ولا يمكن أن يتواصل مهما كانت المبررات والذرائع. كما لا يمكن القبول بمواصلة حكومة الاحتلال الاستهتار بالشرعية الدولية وإبادتها الممنهجة للشعب الفلسطيني دون أي مساءلة أو محاسبة. ترفض المجموعة العربية رفضا باتا استمرار هذه الجريمة وتطالب بتحمل مجلس الأمن لمسؤوليته لفرض دخول المساعدات الإنسانية بشكل كاف وغير معقد لإنقاذ السكان الفلسطينيين ووضع حد لمعاناة، وتجدد في هذا الإطار التأكيد على ضرورة إقرار وقف فوري لإطلاق النار ومنع ممارسات وخطط التهجير القسري وتوفير الحماية الدولية للفلسطينيين في كافة الأرض الفلسطينية المحتلة. وتجدد المجموعة العربية مطالبتها مجلس الأمن بضرورة التصدي لمخططات سلطة الاحتلال باجتياح رفح والتسبب في كارثة إنسانية في حق أكثر من 1.5 مليون فلسطيني في جنوب قطاع غزة. كذلك تجدد المجموعة العربية دعمها الكامل لجهود كبيرة منسقي الأمم المتحدة للشؤون الإنسانية وإعادة الإعمار في غزة سيجريتكان وجهود كل الوكالات الإنسانية وموظفي الإغاثة. وتشدد المجموعة العربية على أهمية تنفيذ آلية المساعدات الإنسانية إلى غزة والتي ترأسها السيدة كوكاد بموجب الولاية المقررة في قرار مجلس الأمن 27/20 لسنة 2023 بهدف رفع مستويات المساعدات الإنسانية وبما يخفف من وطأة الأوضاع المأساوية الحالية في قطاع غزة. كما نؤكد على الدور المحوري لوكالة غوث وتشغيل اللاجئين
the
الفلسطينيين
vital role played by the
ونرفض
Office
محاولات الدفع
of
باتجاه
Refugees for
توسيع ولاية
Palestine,
كبيرة منسق الأمم
UNRWA,
المتحدة للشؤون الإنسانية
and we oppose
وإعادة
any
الإعمار في غزة
attempts
على
to
حساب
expand
ولاية الوكالة
the
المحددة
mandate
وفقا لقرار
of the
الجمعية
coordinator,
العامة
the high-level
رقم
coordinator, to the detriment
302
of UNRWA.
وندين في نفس
That
السياق
mandate was
محاولات
defined under
سلطات
Resolution
الاحتلال
302 of the
استهدافها
General Assembly.
وتفكيكها وإنهاء وجودها
We
خدمة لمخطط
condemn
الإبادة
all
الجماعية ضد
attempts
الشعب الفلسطيني
by
وندعو
occupation
الدول
authorities
المانحة
that target
التي علقت
UNRWA and are
مساهماتها
trying
في
to
تمويل
dismantle it or
الوكالة
to make it
إلى الرجوع
disappear
عن قرارها
in order
واتخاذ
to
إجراءات
use its
عاجلة
genocidal plan
لتأمين
against the Palestinian
تمويل
people.
كامل
We call upon the
ومستدام
donor countries who have
تفاديا
suspended
لمأساة
their
إنسانية
contributions to UNRWA
غير
to
مسبوقة
revisit that
لأكثر
decision
من
and to
مليوني
take urgent
فلسطيني في
measures to
غزة
guarantee
يعتمدون على
sufficient
المساعدات
and lasting
الحيوية
funding to
المقدمة
avoid
من الوكالة
unprecedented
لبقائهم
catastrophic
على قيد الحياة.
humanitarian
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
situation, which they need
I
the
thank the
vital
representative
aid
of
of
Tunisia
UNRWA.
for
Thank
his
you.
statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank you and Algeria, Slovenia, and Switzerland for convening this meeting. We also thank the representatives of OCHA, WFP, and FAO for the briefing. Pakistan's permanent representative is currently acting as the interim chair of the OIC group during the absence of the PR of Mauritania. While I am delivering this statement in our national capacity, our delegation will be coordinating the OIC group for the next few weeks. Madam President, the prevalence of food insecurity worldwide has been severely exacerbated in the wake of the COVID pandemic and challenges posed by geopolitical contestations, conflicts, and climate change. In Gaza, the monumental food security risks have reached a point that is unparalleled in recent history. Israel's ongoing 5-month genocidal military campaign in Gaza has killed 30,000 Palestinians, mostly women and children, and displaced the entire 2.3 million population. According to UN experts, a famine is imminent. 500,000 people in Gaza already face starvation, and 2.3 million are experiencing acute food shortage. While leveling Gaza's cities, Israeli forces have also brazenly destroyed agricultural land and Gaza's fishing fleet. The chilling letter last week from the Commissioner General of UNRWA has noted that, I quote, "The agency has reached breaking point, with Israel's repeated calls to dismantle UNRWA and the freezing of funding by donors at a time of unprecedented humanitarian needs in Gaza," unquote. Obstructing UNRWA's mandate or defunding its operations will have further disastrous consequences for the traumatized people of Gaza and contribute to the collective punishment imposed against them by Israel. Israel's indiscriminate killing of civilians, its destruction of civilian objects indispensable for human survival, and the use of starvation as a weapon of war are gross violations of international humanitarian law, including, plausibly, the Genocide Convention. Madam President, in open defiance of international law and the collective will of the international community, Israel is now preparing for a ground offensive on Rafah. This will further intensify the suffering of the Gaza Palestinians. It also risks further widening the conflict. Our immediate efforts, therefore, must focus on 1. Securing a complete and durable ceasefire without any conditions. The Security Council can no longer defer a demand for a ceasefire in the fragile hope of an agreement in the confidential talks. Israel's planned offensive in Rafah must be stopped. 2. The provisional measures ordered by the ICJ, inter alia, to ensure urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance to the people in Gaza are binding international obligations, and their implementation can and must be enforced. The demonization of UNRWA and the UN must be halted. All donors who have suspended support to UNRWA must reverse their decisions, and all others should expand their assistance. All avenues of aid delivery and supply chains must be opened and utilized. 3. The Security Council must demand the immediate withdrawal of Israeli occupation forces from Gaza and lifting of the 17-year-old blockade. 4. Consider deploying an impartial international mechanism for the protection of Palestinian civilians in Gaza and the West Bank, and to ensure unimpeded humanitarian assistance and subsequent reconstruction support to them. The options offered by the Secretary General should be reviewed in this context. Madam President, Pakistan will work through the Organization of Islamic Cooperation in cooperation with the Arab Group to scale up the delivery of humanitarian assistance to Gaza and explore additional options for alleviating the imminent famine situation. The Security Council must play its part in ensuring that the right conditions are in place for the unimpeded flow of life-saving supplies, including deliveries of food. Madam President, the tragedy we are witnessing in Gaza is in some measure a consequence of the Security Council's failure to secure implementation of its own resolutions and uphold the inalienable right to self-determination of the Palestinian people. The Security Council must ensure that the legitimate struggle for self-determination and freedom of the Palestinian people, and indeed of all peoples struggling to liberate themselves from foreign occupation, receives the unequivocal support as envisaged in the UN Charter. I thank you, Madam.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. Before adjourning this meeting, and even as we end on this somber note, as this is the last scheduled meeting of the Council for the month of February, I would like to express my sincere appreciation, or the sincere appreciation of the delegation of Guyana, to the members of the Council and to the Secretariat of the Council for all the support they have given us. Indeed, it has been a busy month and one which we rallied to consensus on several important issues within our purview. We could only have done it with the hard work, support, and positive contributions of every delegation and the representatives of the Secretariat, including the technical support team, conference service officers, interpreters, verbatim reporters, and security staff. As we end our presidency, I know I speak on behalf of the Council in wishing the delegation of Japan all the best in the month of March. The meeting is adjourned.
تفضل. استيقاظ هسات.
احنا طوال بنقف ورا.
اهلا وسهلا.
تفضلوا شباب.
الشباب بالمقدمة.
لا الطوال ورا والقصارين قدام.
نبدأ بالعربي ولا بالانجليزي شو رايك؟
انجليزي العربي مش
As you all know, that the Security Council just finished a very important open meeting regarding the White Note, which was prepared by the Secretary General about the danger of using starvation and famine as a tool of war, which is illegal, and in accordance with a special resolution 2710, I believe, in the year 2018, the Secretary General was requested to submit a report when he sees a danger of using that as a weapon in armed conflict. You all heard the statements. Everybody expressed their concerns and showed empathy with the Palestinian people against such danger, but also the great majority of members indicated that if we seriously want to stop starvation against the 2.3 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, what we need is a ceasefire, immediate ceasefire, and it has to take place now, as was called for by the Secretary General months ago, and even he used his authority under Article 99 of the Charter and brought the attention to the Security Council demanding a humanitarian ceasefire. Unfortunately, until this moment, we do not see the Security Council adopting a resolution calling for a ceasefire, including humanitarian ceasefire as requested or called for by the Secretary General. We are very grateful to Algeria, to Guyana, to Switzerland and Slovenia for calling for this open meeting to dwell on the White Note or the report of the Secretary General, which it might be revisited again at the end of month of March. But we felt, and these countries, which we are grateful to them, led by Algeria, called for this meeting now to continue the pressure on the Security Council to act, and to act now and as swiftly as possible to call for a ceasefire to save lives and to stop Israel from possibly invading Rafah and endangering 1.4 million civilians, Palestinians, who are cramped into that narrow area in Rafah and around Rafah, and the danger of pushing them into Sinai and having a second Nakba imposed on the Palestinian people. The Arab group decided, and we are implementing the strategy to keep pressuring the Security Council to act, to shoulder its responsibility, and we will be also pressuring the General Assembly. We requested a number of meetings. Tomorrow at 11 o'clock, the Arab group and the OIC as a whole will be having a meeting to discuss further the details of the strategy that was adopted by the Arab group to expand the support to the strategy to include the OIC, to include NAM, the African group, the European countries, and also the Latin American countries. We have to keep knocking on the door of the General Assembly, the door of the Security Council, until we see an end to this tragedy and to this carnage the Palestinian people are going through as a result of the aggression of the State of Israel against our people. Let me also tell you that it was decided by the President of the General Assembly that there will be a meeting in the General Assembly under the veto initiative, in which the country that casted a veto when we voted on the last attempt in the Security Council for a ceasefire, humanitarian ceasefire, what is known as the Algerian draft. Now we are going to have a debate in the Security Council for why a permanent member casted a veto in spite of the fact that 13.5 members of the Security Council were in favor of ceasefire. In fact, the half country today added another half, and they're calling for an immediate halt or stopping of the fighting that eventually would lead to no fighting to take place at all. So this is where we are, and I want also to inform you that we will be having 10 plus a child from victims or relatives to those who lost a large number of their families in Gaza. They will be on the 6th around noon meeting with the Secretary General, and we are coordinating through my brother, the ambassador of Algeria, to have a meeting, informal luncheon with them, with members of the Security Council. And in the afternoon, we will have a large meeting of the Arab countries, the OIC, and maybe NAM, and all those who want to join us to listen to those victims and the stories of their families. The child, he is 5 years old, is hosted by a family in Staten Island to treat him, and he will be among them, and we will see if we can also organize a press conference for them so that they can engage you and that you can ask them questions, and I hope that you can tell their stories to all of your audience, the people that you write to and the people whom you report to through your cameras and through your radio programs on media possibilities. We thank you for being with us. We keep informing you. We will continue to do so that you can tell the tragedy of the Palestinian people, and in addition to that, to keep the pressure on those who are not listening, to the hundreds of millions who are in the streets, including New York City, calling for a ceasefire and a ceasefire now. And we hope that those who are in authority, who are not listening to this massive call from every corner of the globe, to listen to them and to have a ceasefire in order to save lives of the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip and to save lives, period. If you have one or two questions, and then we will call it over.
Ambassador, thank you. Ibtisam Azim, Al Arabi Al Jadid newspaper. First, two questions. First, you talked last week about the efforts of that you are trying to have a signature or a list of countries to support your efforts for a full membership of Palestine in the General Assembly. If you could please update us on that. And my second question is the Americans today, the American ambassador talked today about or urged Israel to allow more aid. How serious is this demand, do you think, given the fact that the Americans continue to deliver weapons to the Israelis? Thank you.
I will start with the second one. The Israeli ambassador repeated that. He repeated this big lie that also his PR often repeated that in the Security Council, that there is no limit to humanitarian aid that can go into Gaza. But the UN does not have the capacity to handle it. Now the question is that the UN has the capacity to handle it. The UNRWA has 13,000 employees that they can deliver humanitarian assistance to scale to all corners of the Gaza Strip. But if the bombing is on top of their heads and the tanks artillery are killing them, and they killed so far more than 160 of UNRWA employees and other UN employees, then if your life is in danger, it's not that you don't have capacity. You are afraid to carry out your duty under these conditions. If we have a ceasefire and they stop endangering their lives, not only they will see the 13,000 brave employees of UNRWA taking the maximum amount of humanitarian aid to reach all parts of Gaza, starting with the north and the south and the east and the west and everywhere. And I can even say that they might have an additional 5,000 or 10,000 volunteers from international humanitarian organizations and brave doctors that will come running to Gaza in order to save lives in the Gaza Strip. So therefore, this lie by the Israeli representatives that they will welcome an unlimited amount of humanitarian aid to come, and in fact he said there are 500 truckloads outside Karim Abu Salim ready to enter, but the United Nations does not have the capacity to handle these things. This is a big lie. It is, there is fear for everyone in Gaza, including UNRWA employees and others, as long as there is bombing and killing and tanks and artillery and all kinds of weapons, killing everyone in the Gaza Strip. If you do not look for a place to hide in order to save your life, then even if you have 10,000 truckloads, and maybe thousands of truckloads are lining up from Al Arish to Rafah, but because of this situation in the Gaza Strip, it is not possible to distribute much. That's why almost 14 members in the Security Council have been calling for a ceasefire in order to allow the distribution of humanitarian assistance to take place. Now, with regard to the first question that you asked about the admission, now the meetings tomorrow and more meetings that will take place, we will be refining that strategy for moving into the Security Council with a draft resolution calling for the admission of the State of Palestine to membership. Now, I mentioned to you the possibility of having, a statement with signature. Through our meetings and discussions, we came to the decision that we will have a hybrid form. What does that mean? We have in an Arab summit and OIC summit combined, there is unanimous decision for supporting the State of Palestine for admission. So therefore, we will say all the Arab group, all the OIC, the combined 57 countries, and we had a summit in Kampala, Uganda, and I had the honor of attending it. And it was adopted unanimously at the level of the summit. 120 countries are endorsing this idea. So therefore, we will indicate that the Arab groups are endorsing, the OIC group is endorsing, the NAM group is endorsing, so we're starting from 120 countries. And then we will seek the endorsement and signatures of others who do not belong to these three groups, so that our number, we are starting from 120 plus many others who will be joining us in signing for that statement before we go to the Security Council with a draft resolution for admission. We will announce the number of countries that are endorsing and supporting this effort. Edith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. President Biden said that he expects a deal for a temporary ceasefire and release of hostages by next Monday. Do you believe this is possible? And U.S. officials have said that they would like to see this go through the entire period of Ramadan. How important would that be?
We sincerely hope that those who are negotiating, I believe today and yesterday in Doha, and they might have moved to Cairo in agreement on what they agreed to in Paris, to happen as quickly as possible. In fact, we were all, hoping that this exercise would come to a positive end weeks ago. And in fact, part of giving additional time to members of the Security Council when they were in Colombia, because some said that there is a possibility of agreement in the next few days. And out of flexibility and responsibility, the Arab representative, on behalf of all of us, Algeria, was gracious enough to give members of the Security Council the additional time, hoping that it will happen. Unfortunately, it did not happen. That's why we went to the Security Council with our draft that did not survive because of the veto. However, we are ready and hoping tonight, tomorrow, the day after, as soon as possible, to reach an agreement, because we want to save lives. We want to see the end of the killing and the fighting by the Israeli occupying authorities against our civilian population. We want to feed them. We want to send them water and medicine and all of the sustenance of life, and that was the subject of the meeting that we just concluded in the Security Council. So therefore, we hope the President of the United States is the President of the United States. If he said that by Monday that there will be a ceasefire, what do you think? You are a seasoned diplomat. You've been around for a long period of time. When the President of the United States speaks, how should we take it?
I'm a seasoned journalist, not a seasoned diplomat. That's why I'm asking you.
Okay, but anyhow, so we hope that something happens, but nevertheless, we will keep knocking on the door, and we will continue to contribute from our side to reach the moment of having a ceasefire, to begin the process of attending to the wounds of our people and healing the situation in Gaza and rebuilding it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
يعطيكم العافية.
الله يعافيك.